He is about to be crowned, and it is going to hurt. Not a crown of gold, a crown twisted by hand out of thorns, and someone is pressing it down. Most paintings of this moment in Christ's life are crowded. A courtyard full of soldiers, a jeering mob pressed in from every side, onlookers in the doorway, in the shadows, on the stairs. For centuries, that's how artists painted the mockery of Christ, as a scene about a crowd. Carl Bloch painted it with exactly one other person in the room. That single choice is the reason this painting is still unsettling more than 140 years after he made it. There's no mob to disappear into here, no safety in numbers, nothing to blame on a crowd getting carried away. Just two men alone in near total dark, and one of them is doing something he's fully decided on his own to do. Today I want to slow down on this one painting, take apart what's actually happening in it, notice the details most people scroll past, and then step back and ask why a quiet, private Danish painter working in 1880 made these choices at all. Because the more you learn about who Carl Bloch was and what he'd just lived through, the less this painting looks like a simple Bible illustration, and the more it looks like a confession. On the surface, this is a scene almost every Christian tradition has painted before. After Jesus is arrested, Roman soldiers dress him up as a mock king. A purple or red robe thrown over his shoulders, a crown twisted from thorns, a reed pressed into his hand like a scepter. It's humiliation staged as theatre. The soldiers aren't torturing him yet. They're performing a joke, and Christ is the punchline. But think again about that composition. Nearly every artist who tackled this subject before Bloch, Titian, Caravaggio, Bosch, Grunewald, filled the frame with a crowd. Mockery, in their versions, is a group activity. It needs an audience, and it needs witnesses, so the cruelty can spread out and dilute across a dozen faces. Bloch removes almost everyone. No architecture to speak of, no bystanders, no background, just two figures pressed close together in near total darkness, and that changes the emotional registers completely. This isn't mob cruelty anymore, the kind you can excuse as people getting swept up in a moment. It's one person alone choosing to be cruel to someone who cannot fight back. It's intimate, it's uncomfortably ordinary. It could be anyone. Look at the soldier for a second. His expression isn't blank cruelty, and it isn't glee either. It's something closer to contempt. He's leaning in close, jeering, his face pulled into a scornful sneer as he pushes the crown of thorns down with the reed, twisting it into Christ's scalp, while blood beads along the forehead. This is what art historians describing the piece have called malicious derision. A look that says, "You deserve this, not this," is fun. That distinction matters. A soldier enjoying himself would be almost easier to write off as a sadist, an aberration. A soldier sneering with genuine contempt, fully convinced of his own righteousness in that moment, is a much more familiar and more unsettling kind of cruelty. Now look at Christ. His face is calm, not blank, not defeated, but held. There's real physical pain registering at the brow, but nothing in his expression is asking for pity. And here's the part that takes people a moment to register. His eyes are not on the man hurting him. Follow the line of his gaze, and it doesn't stop at the soldier at all. It clears the edge of the canvas entirely and lands somewhere out in the room where you're standing. Museum curators who've written about this piece have described it as though Christ is silently asking, "Will you mock me also?" And once you notice it, you can't unsee it, as long as the cruelty in this painting stays contained between Christ and the soldier. You get to watch from a safe distance, the way you'd watch any historical scene. The moment his eyes clear that soldier's shoulder and find you instead, the distance collapses. You stop being an observer of what happened to him and start being asked something about what you would have done. Here's where it gets more interesting, because Bloch was trained in a very specific tradition, and once you know what to look for, you start seeing his fingerprints everywhere. The most obvious technical device in this painting is light. Bloch uses a heavy, deliberate chiaroscuro, a term borrowed from Renaissance and Baroque, painting meaning the dramatic contrast between light and dark. Christ's face and upper body sit in a pool of soft, almost internally generated light, while the soldier and the surrounding space fall into shadow. This isn't naturalistic lighting. There's no visible torch or window producing it. The light is symbolic. It's separating the sacred from the profane using nothing but paint. This technique didn't come from nowhere. As a young man, Bloch travelled through the Netherlands on his way to study in Italy, and he became fascinated with Rembrandt. The way Rembrandt could carve a figure out of darkness using almost nothing but a single source of glowing light. That influence never left him. You can trace a direct line from a 17th century Dutch studio to this 19th century Danish church wall. Notice too how understated the props of mockery are. The crown of thorns isn't an oversized theatrical prop. It's small, tight, almost clinical in how precisely it's rendered. The reed the soldier uses isn't a scepter-sized staff. It's a thin stick, almost pathetic looking, which makes the mockery feel even more petty and small-minded. Bloch had a reputation even among his contemporaries for an almost obsessive realism. He wanted every object in a religious scene to feel like it could have existed, not like stage dressing. And here's a detail almost nobody brings up. This painting actually exists in two versions. Bloch painted it twice in 1880, one in the rich, warm colour you're looking at now, and a second, more muted, almost grey-toned version that was lost for decades and only rediscovered through a 1935 auction catalogue before eventually surfacing again in a museum collection. Painting the same emotionally difficult composition twice, nearly identically, tells you something about how much this particular scene mattered to him. This wasn't a quick commission he wanted to be done with. He returned to it. So, who was this man, and why did he paint this specifically in 1880? Carl Bloch was born in Copenhagen in 1834. His family wanted him to become a naval officer, a respectable, stable profession, and he wanted none of it. He was, by every account, consumed from childhood with the idea of becoming a painter, and he pushed his way into the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts against his parents' wishes. That tension between security and calling would define the shape of his whole life. He trained under the Danish painter Wilhelm Marstrand, then travelled to Italy on a scholarship, where he spent roughly 7 years absorbing the techniques of the old masters and, crucially, deepening that Rembrandt influence I mentioned earlier. It was in Italy that his ambitions shifted, away from small domestic scenes and toward large-scale historical and religious subjects. It was also in Italy, in Rome, where he met the woman who would become his wife, Alma Trepka. Now here's the pivotal moment. In 1865, an industrialist named J.C. Jacobsen, the founder of the Carlsberg Brewery of all people, saw Bloch's work and arranged for him to receive one of the most prestigious religious commissions in Danish history. 23 paintings depicting the life of Christ to fill the King's Oratory Chapel at Frederiksborg Castle, which had recently been gutted by fire. Bloch was 31 years old. It would take him 14 years to complete. That project consumed the bulk of his working life through the 1860s and 70s. He married Alma in 1868, right in the middle of it. They had 8 children together. And by the time the Frederiksborg Commission was finally finished in 1879, Bloch wasn't just a working artist anymore. He was, by near universal consensus, Denmark's foremost painter of religious subjects, elected to the Royal Academy at 31, decorated at the Paris World's Fair, a national figure. The Mocking of Christ was painted in 1880. the year immediately after that 14-year Royal Commission finally ended. Think about what that means. This wasn't a young artist auditioning for religious subject matter. This was a man who had just spent nearly a decade and a half living inside the story of Christ's life, painting scene after scene for a royal chapel, and who, freed finally from that singular obligation, chose almost immediately to keep going, to paint this scene for a parish church in Ordrup on his own terms, without a royal patron dictating the brief. And by all accounts from people close to him, something had shifted in him over those 14 years. Art historians who've studied his letters note that Bloch talked about religion sparingly and plainly. He wasn't a man given to grand theological statements, but friends and biographers who knew him described a change that seemed to begin specifically with the Frederiksborg paintings, as though the act of painting Christ's life year after year had made him genuinely religious in a way he hadn't been as a younger man. One friend recalled him saying simply, "God helps me, that's what I think, and then I am calm." That's the emotional context sitting underneath this painting. It isn't the work of a man fulfilling a contract. It's the work of a man who had just spent 14 years living inside this story, and for whom the mockery of Christ may have stopped being an abstract historical event and started feeling like something closer to personal testimony. So, why does any of this still land more than a century later? Partly it's technical, the lighting, the restraint, the refusal to give you a crowd to hide inside, but mostly, I think, it's the combination of that emptied out composition with everything we now know was happening around it. Bloch wasn't painting a distant historical atrocity from a safe remove. He was a man near the end of a 14-year religious commission that had, by his friend's own account, changed what he believed, and he built a scene with no crowd left to blend into, where the only two people in the room are the one causing harm and the one absorbing it, until eventually your own eyes land in the middle of it too. It's worth noting Bloch never set out to be remembered as a religious painter specifically. He initially wanted to paint portraits and everyday scenes. It was Italy and then Frederiksborg that pulled him somewhere else entirely. And this painting, made in that narrow window right after the commission ended and right before the grief began, might be the clearest single image of exactly who he had become. There's no mob in this painting to hide inside, and by the end, no safe distance either. It's worth sitting with why Bloch decided, after everything he'd just spent 14 years painting, that this particular stripped down moment was the one worth returning to on his own.